All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our lecture, Belief and Awesomeness. I am Professor Leslie Keel. I teach history here at Portable College, and I am the coordinator of CHAP. The Portable College Cultural and Historical Awareness Program, CHAP, was organized in 2002 to enhance students' awareness of certain important aspects of our society to which they may have previously had little to no exposure. A theme is chosen by CHAP members each school year, and faculty members across the campus are encouraged to integrate elements of that theme into their coursework. By subtly saturating students with information about the chosen topic throughout the year, the awareness of the entire campus community is elevated. Our theme for the next 2 years, fall 2024 to spring 2026, was voted on by over 200 students last year. That theme is Don't Stop Believing, all things belief systems, spirituality, religion, and secular humanism. We'll be exploring the different ways humans have answered and wrestled with the big questions. Who are we, and why are we here? I hope you will join us at upcoming CHAP events during the semester, including our next event, in which CHAP is partnering with Umoja to celebrate Black History Month. On February 21st at 7 p.m. right here in the theater, we'll be hearing from Reverend Dennis Hudson speaking on Allensworth, the town that refuses to die. I want to quickly thank our maintenance staff, CHAP committee, Roger Perez, Daisy Rodriguez, and President Monteraz for all their work and support in making these events possible. An extra special thank you to the College Foundation and John Reed Trust for sponsoring this event. Our speaker today is Dr. Benjamin Mitchell-Yellen. He's a PhD and director of the Teaching and Learning Center and associate professor of philosophy at Sam Houston State University. Dr. Mitchell-Yellen has published a book, Near-Death Experiences, Understanding Visions of the Afterlife, and dozens of articles for academic and general audiences on a variety of topics, including immortality, meaning in life, values, agency, racism, and teaching in the age of generative AI. He received a BA in Creative Writing and Literature from the Residential College at the University of Michigan, an MA in Philosophy from Boston College, and a PhD in philosophy from the University of California, Riverside, where he also served as a postdoc on the Immortality Project. A quick disclaimer, the views and opinions expressed in this presentation are those of the speaker and do not necessarily reflect the views of Portable College or its affiliates. Once Dr. Mitchell-Yellen is done speaking, we will open up for questions from the audience. Our event tonight will end roughly at 8 p.m., and once the event is over, Debbie Lou and I will have proof of attendance cards for those who need them. So with that, please give a warm welcome to Dr. Mitchell-Yellen.
Thank you very much, Leslie. Y'all can hear me on the mic? Okay, great. Thank you very much. Really cool. Thank you to Leslie and to Matt for inviting me out. This is really special. What a cool thing to have a speaker series like this in your town. I'm really jealous. Also, Don't Stop Believing, that's such a great title. I have to say that one of the best shows I saw was a Journey cover band at an outdoor concert series in Riverside, so that's really cool. Yeah. And I'm really excited to talk with you tonight, so I'm going to have some stuff to say. I'll try not to drone on too long, although I did end up having to write it all down because I wanted to say it how I wanted to express it. So I don't have a PowerPoint, I'll be boring and I'll read and I'll try to look up at you. But I hope that you have questions and comments, so that'll be the most special part for me. So I'm going to launch in so that we can get to that. Right? The title of the talk is Belief and Awesomeness, and I want to think together tonight about awesomeness. I'm interested in the dictionary definition of the term, inspiring awe, and actually I'm going to be interested in a rather small slice of the awesome pie. I'm not going to be talking about awesome people or awesome actions. There are other philosophers, Nick Riggle, for example, has given an analysis of that. I want to focus on things, especially experiences that inspire awe. Experiences that even when we hear about them secondhand, they make our jaws drop, make us shake our heads, maybe even wish we could experience something like that, though you may want to be careful what you wish for, because I'm going to talk about near-death experiences. Now, I've never had an NDE, that's the shorthand acronym, right? I've never had an NDE myself, but I've spoken with people who have, and I've read many accounts. But I thought to set the stage that I'd give you some famous examples drawn from what is really like a voluminous literature on near-death experiences. So let's begin with two American bestsellers. Aben Alexander's Proof of Heaven details a trip to what he calls a beautiful, incredible dream world during a 7-day coma that was caused by bacterial meningitis. Alexander, a neurosurgeon committed to the scientific worldview, rode on butterfly wings, met a deceased sister he never knew he had, and was told in a nonverbal language that he was loved. The experience changed his life as well as his outlook on reality. Maybe you're familiar with the book, or his follow-up book. Todd Burpo's Heaven is for Real, written with Lynn Vincent, has been turned into a kid's book and a movie starring Greg Kinnear. Colton Burpo, Todd's son, underwent emergency surgery twice for a burst appendix at age 3. Over the next several months, Colton related an amazing experience he had during his first surgery. He told of leaving his body and visiting heaven, personally meeting Jesus, God, and the Holy Spirit. He also told of meeting his deceased grandfather and a miscarried sister he had never been told about. He related seeing his parents in the hospital while he was under the knife, and the details he gave were accurate. They really were in separate rooms, his mother praying and talking on the phone, and his father praying alone. These near-death experiences were not only profound and meaningful to those who had them, they've been a source of inspiration to millions of people. But NDEs are not only found in the pages of bestsellers. In an article published in The Lancet, a highly regarded medical journal, cardiologist Pim Van Lommel and colleagues tell of a man whose dentures went missing after they were taken out of his mouth so he could receive CPR following cardiac arrest. The hospital staff was unable to locate his dentures for several days until he saw a male nurse walk into his recovery room, and he said, "You know where they are, because you put them in that drawer." It came out that the patient had watched himself be resuscitated from a position near the ceiling, and his dentures were found because his recollection was accurate. And now my favorite NDE is the case of Pam Reynolds. In 1991, she underwent a radical form of brain surgery. In addition to being put to sleep with anesthesia, this surgery involved taking her brain offline, which they verified in several ways. Electrodes on her skull picked up electrical activity, and earplugs molded into her ears pumped loud, rapid clicks, and the reception of these clicks was measured all the way down on her brain stem. Once her brain was shut down, they cooled her body temperature and drained her brain of blood. After repairing her aneurysm, they brought her back to life. Upon waking up, Reynolds recalled her experience of floating out of the top of her head and witnessing various strange things. She heard a conversation between members of the medical team about her difficult veins, and the unpleasant sound of the bone saw used to cut her skull. The conversation really did happen, and the bone saw was as she described it, but that was not all she experienced. She also had an incredibly vivid, life-changing experience in some other realm, where she was bathed in bright light and visited with deceased relatives who eventually sent her back to her body. These experiences are truly wild, don't you think? They also share some core features. All of them, except the man with the missing dentures, involve traveling to another realm and communicating with deceased loved ones. And all of them, except Alexander's, involve some form of what in the literature is referred to as veridical perception. These subjects saw or heard things that actually happened. Veridical, root word of true, veritas. So Burpo saw his parents praying. The unnamed patient saw his dentures being removed. Reynolds heard the medical staff talking about her veins. They also involve things like pleasant feelings, tunnels and light, and profound personal transformations. NDEs are awesome if anything is. And now that we have some examples before us, I want to think together about what's so awesome about them. More to the point, I want to think about the relationship between explanations and awesomeness. I'm going to try to convince you that despite how things may seem, we don't need to believe that NDEs reveal supernatural elements of reality to make room for their awesomeness. First, I think it'll help if we define NDEs and say a bit more about how they might be explained. So we can define an NDE as a special conscious experience had by an individual in a situation that is or is perceived by them to be life-threatening. I told you to be careful what you wish for. There are two things that make consciousness special in these cases. First, NDEs often occur at times when one wouldn't expect someone to be capable of conscious experience. People have NDEs when they're under anesthesia or their heart isn't pumping blood. These aren't exactly the sort of folks that you'd expect to be seeing or hearing anything. Second, NDEs have certain kinds of content that fit familiar patterns. In fact, scales have been developed to measure the reliability of reports and the depth of NDEs. The idea is that more reliable and or deeper NDEs have more items from a list of common characteristics, such as warm, pleasant feelings, a life review where you see life flash before your eyes, an out-of-body experience, a visit to another realm, presence of light, and so on. You can recognize items from this list in the examples that I began with. Near-death experiences are also quite widespread. Roughly 1 in 5 patients who survive cardiac arrest report having one. They're reported all over the world and have been for millennia. In fact, the myth of the final book of Plato's Republic, published some 2,500 years ago, is an extended NDE. The takeaway is supposed to be that if we weren't convinced by Socrates' arguments for the importance of justice, then maybe we'll be convinced by this tale that shows us how consequential it is in the context of choosing our next lives. More recently, as we've seen, NDEs are reported in bestsellers and medical journals. Now, not all NDEs are positive. There are reports of going to hell as well as heaven. And some of the details vary given different cultural contexts. The afterlife, as described by differs from the one described by Burpo, which differs in turn from that described by a contemporary Japanese Buddhist. But there are many similarities. I want to think together now about how to make sense of NDEs. Do they really prove that heaven is for real? Does accepting the reports of NDEs compel us to accept the truth of supernaturalism? Does believing in NDEs require believing that consciousness is not tied to the body? That there are other realms than the ones we experience with our 5 senses? That reality outstrips the scientific worldview? Or, alternatively, can we accept both that these reports are true and also that everything is physical, that everything can, in principle, if not in practice, be explained in terms of the measurable and the observable? I'm going to try to convince you that there's no inconsistency in accepting the truth of NDEs and explaining them in wholly naturalistic terms. And I'll pursue this argument by way of responding to some criticisms. Namely, first, that naturalistic explanations require not believing NDEers' reports of their own experiences. Second, that they amount to disrespecting NDEers. And finally, third, that they undermine the awesomeness of NDEs. Let me put all this in terms of the title of the talk, Belief and Awesomeness. I'm going to suggest that belief in NDEs and believing NDEers doesn't require belief in the supernatural. And neither does an appreciation of their awesomeness. Actually, I'll suggest awesomeness is connected with not knowing what to believe. As I've already intimated, these claims are controversial. I've received consistent pushback in the past decade or so of publishing and speaking about these topics, so tonight I want to offer some responses. You're like my guinea pigs, I'm testing these out. One common complaint may be put like this: naturalistic explanations of NDEs are debunking explanations. They're inconsistent with accepting NDEers' experiences as real. This complaint's well-intentioned. I certainly don't want to engage in discounting or discrediting the experiences of others, especially not people sharing deeply meaningful experiences from vulnerable times in their lives. But it's important to recognize the distinction between two senses in which an experience may be considered real. I'll put some well-worn labels on them. There's the subjective sense of real and the objective sense of real. An experience is real in the subjective sense if the experiencing subject really had that experience. A wide variety of experiences are real in this sense. Among them, everyday perceptual experiences, such as hearing my words and seeing the person sitting next to you. And also hallucinations, such as the proverbial pink elephant. While both the experience of seeing your neighbor and seeing the elephant are real in the subjective sense, only the first is real in the objective sense. The content of your visual experience matches reality in the case of seeing the person seated next to you, but not in the case of seeing the pink elephant. Hallucinations, by definition, do not correspond to reality. And not just hallucinations. There are perceptual illusions of various kinds. It's even possible to misremember things, recalling a past experience in a manner that doesn't align with how things really went down. In all of these cases, we have real experiences. That is, experiences that are real in the subjective sense. The dude tripping really does see the elephant just as much as the person next to him sees him staring off into space at a figment of his imagination. But the fact that the hallucination is real in the subjective sense doesn't mean it's real to a court. There's no pink elephant, which means that the dude's visual experience is both real and not real. It's subjectively real and objectively unreal. It's possible then to both believe someone who woke up from a coma saying that they traveled to another realm and to insist that there's no such realm. We can believe that they had this experience without believing that the content of the experience was accurate. Maybe the explanation is that their brain activity spiked in the moments before they were coming out of their coma, and this generated an intense perceptual experience of a journey through dimensions. In the subjective sense, this experience was very real. But that doesn't mean that they actually left their body and traveled to another realm. But what about experiences that include contents that do match reality? How do we explain Colton Burpo seeing his parents praying? Or the dentures dude seeing where his dentures were placed? Or Pam Reynolds hearing the conversation between attendants? In these cases, there appears to be no distinction to be made between subjectively and objectively real experience. If we believe that Reynolds heard the conversation about her veins, and we know that this conversation took place as she recalls, then we seem to be forced into conceding that her NDE was real in both senses. Then again, perhaps not. Pursuing these issues can quickly get us in deep waters, and I want to make sure to have some time for awesomeness. But I do want to say something about how the naturalist can go about explaining NDEs that involve veridical perception. And this comment will be relevant when we get to consider awesomeness. In our book, Near-Death Experiences, Understanding Visions of the Afterlife, John Martin Fisher and I lay out a 3-step strategy for explaining NDEs in naturalistic terms. Step 1, explain how the subject of the NDE acquired the information relevant to their experience. Step 2, explain why this particular content would be included in an NDE. And step 3, explain when the experience took place. And we point out that not all NDEs would have the same explanation. Indeed, to think that they must would be to misunderstand how explanation works in general. Not all house fires, for instance, are explained in exactly the same way. Why would all NDEs be explained in the same way? We also emphasize that we're not currently able to give naturalistic explanations for all NDEs. But this is just how science works. We build on what we know, expanding our resources as we go. Let me say something about how this explanatory strategy might play out in relation to my favorite NDE. Auditory sensations may have registered in Pam Reynolds' brain below the level of conscious awareness, and despite the presence of the earphones and clicks. She may not have been fully sedated at the time of the conversation about her veins, and her brainstem may not have been shut down yet. That's the first step. The second step is to note that this content may have been important to her because it could have had the function of reducing her anxiety about the operation, to have knowledge of what the medical staff was doing to her body. The third step is to note that it's entirely possible that the time at which these auditory sensations registered in her brain may not be the same as the time at which she became consciously aware of them. Though it seemed to her as if she experienced hearing the conversation at the time the conversation occurred, she may have had the experience of hearing it later, perhaps as she came out from under anesthesia. Now look, I want to acknowledge that this is a rather provisional and speculative explanation, and it's only of one part of a very rich NDE. I don't pretend to have just made sense of all of Pam Reynolds' experience. That's not my point. My point is to illustrate how we might go about explaining this NDE in naturalistic terms. It doesn't seem out of bounds to say that we may be able to piece together naturalistic explanations of these experiences, some elements of which may involve placeholders, where we aren't quite certain what to say, or where we need to wait for improvements in technology or our understanding about how our brains and bodies work. And I readily admit that there's room to question things. My aim isn't to provide the definitive explanation of Pam Reynolds' NDE. My aim is to suggest that there's reason for optimism about such an explanation, that it's possible. In fact, the incompleteness of this explanation is very welcome. I'm going to argue that part of what's awesome about NDEs is that they reveal our lack of understanding. And I promise we'll get there. But first I want to consider one other issue. I'm trying to show that the naturalist isn't a jerk. And I should acknowledge that it would be a jerk move to respond to an NDEer by saying, oh sure, your experience was subjectively real, but objectively unreal. I mean, that's like the most philosopher thing to say ever, probably. And in that sense, philosophers can be jerks. And that brings me to a second criticism that I've often encountered. To explain NDEs in naturalistic terms is to disrespect NDEers. Even if, strictly speaking, it's possible to believe their stories in the way I've been suggesting, many people think that NDEers have special standing as the subjects of these profound experiences. And to deny their supernatural interpretations is to discount them all the same. This complaint relies on the claim that NDEers have a privileged epistemic status with respect to their experiences. Since they were the ones directly acquainted with the contents of those experiences, we should accept their interpretations of them. More to the point, we should accept their interpretations of how to explain what they experienced. So if an NDEer is convinced that their experience of watching themselves receive CPR is best explained in terms of their soul separating from their body, then we should defer to this explanation. I don't want to deny that the subject of an experience has a privileged status with respect to what they experienced. This is part of the reason why I think it's important to default to the position that no matter how extraordinary, we should take NDEers at their word and accept their experiences as real in the subjective sense. They really did experience them. Now, of course, there are exceptions to this rule. The case of, and I swear I'm not making this up, the case of Alex Malarkey, for instance, is one where we have good reason to deny that there was any real NDE. It seems as if, true to his name, he made it up at the behest of his father, who wanted the payday that would come with a book deal. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that Aben Alexander's credibility has come under fire. So I'm not saying that we should believe people no matter what. What I'm saying is that we should be disposed to believe NDEers that their experiences were subjectively real. that they experienced what they say they did. But it doesn't follow that we should accept that their experiences were objectively real, that the contents of their experiences were accurate, or that we should accept that they have any special insight into why they experienced what they did. An experiencing subject may be an expert when it comes to what they experienced, but that doesn't make them an expert about the workings of our perceptual systems. We can and should, absent compelling reasons not to, accept that the CPR patient saw himself receiving CPR, and we can corroborate the contents of that experience with the testimony of the medical staff. But we need not accept that the explanation of what happened is that he was for a time a disembodied soul, no matter how convinced he may be that this is the truth. When I say these things, though, one common response I get, and you might be thinking this in your own head, is that I'm pathologizing NDEs, or NDEers. Like a few moments ago, I compared experiences that are real only in the subjective sense to hallucinations. I said it's like seeing a pink elephant. And there are people who take offense to this. They say that to compare NDEs to acid trips or other hallucinations is to disparage them and those who have them. And here I think we need to tread lightly, for this is a delicate issue. On the one hand, there are some good reasons for NDEers to be wary about coming forward and telling their stories. They may fear skepticism from the public, and especially from medical professionals. We don't want to discourage them from telling their stories. For one thing, it's unfair to them. I really do think that the vast majority of NDEers are trying to be truthful. For another, our ability to understand this phenomenon will be hindered if the subjects of these experiences are loath to come forward and share them with us. Even those skeptical of supernatural explanations of NDEs ought to make it as comfortable as possible for NDEers to speak openly about their experiences and how they interpret them. On the other hand, though, it's a real shame that the term hallucination has the negative connotation it does. To say that someone hallucinated is, to most people's ears, to express that they either took a banned substance or else were afflicted with something like a psychotic episode. It's to disparage their behavior or their biology. It's understandable that NDEers wouldn't want to be treated in this way. They didn't choose to have the experiences they did, no matter how welcome or life-changing those experiences may have been. And they aren't psychotic. There's nothing wrong with them. I can see why it really would seem unfair to suggest otherwise. But the fact of the matter is that hallucinations are very common. In fact, I'd be willing to bet that most of you have had one in the recent past. When was the last time you thought you heard your phone ding, or thought you felt it vibrate in your pocket, when in fact no one called or texted you? Raise your hand. Yeah, all right? So this is called phantom phone syndrome, and it's really widespread. I've seen figures as high as 2/3 of subjects experiencing it, with more than one in 10 experiencing it daily. Some estimates suggest that over 1 in 10 adults hear voices when no one's speaking, even though only about 1 in 100 or even fewer than that people are schizophrenic. And then there are induced hallucinations. It's fairly easy to get people to see or hear something that doesn't occur, basically by priming them to do so. For example, you present subjects with the repeated experience of seeing a light flash at the same time they hear a tone. And then, after a while, you just flash the light without the tone, and subjects will be quite likely to hear a phantom tone when they see the light go off. It turns out that perception is partly based on prediction. Our perceptual systems aren't passive. We actively anticipate incoming sensory evidence on the basis of prior beliefs and experience. And this means that you're more likely to pick up on information that you expect to receive, and also that you may incorrectly perceive, i.e. hallucinate, when the world fails to give you what you expect. Again, there's nothing wrong with people in these cases. These misfirings of our perceptual systems are the effects of the extremely complicated workings of our brains and bodies finely tuned over a vast expanse of time. Now, look, I don't pretend that simply citing induced hallucination studies and drawing attention to the phantom phone phenomenon will serve to destigmatize the hallucination label. I still think we need to be careful here. But my point is that there should be no stigma attached with the simple claim that somebody hallucinated something. And in fact, there may be good reasons for explaining at least some elements of NDEs in this way. Who knows? Perhaps by talking more about these issues, we can normalize hallucinations enough so that the stigma really does wear off. In any case, insofar as we want to get to the bottom of what's going on in cases of near-death experiences, then we should be open to follow the evidence where it leads, with due sensitivity, of course. All right, let me pause and review what we've been up to so far. We reviewed some famous, fascinating cases of NDEs, and we considered some core similarities shared by NDEs across time and place. Then we thought about how to explain these sorts of experiences. I argued that supernatural explanations are not required either to believe NDEers or to respect them. We can believe NDEers that they had a given experience even if we don't believe that the content of that experience matched reality. And we can respect the privileged access NDEers have to the subjective reality of their experiences without accepting that they have some special access to how best to explain them. And appeals to explanatory factors like hallucinations shouldn't in any way denigrate the subjects of NDEs. All right, so now I want to finally turn to the issue I've been promising to address all along, awesomeness. As I've already told you, I'm going to make the case that naturalistic explanations of NDEs need not undermine their awesomeness. And in fact, I'm going to push the envelope even further. I'm going to argue that part of the reason NDEs are so awe-inspiring is that they reveal gaps in our understanding. And that this is just as true for the supernaturalist as for the naturalist. So let's continue with the theme of responding to objections. One response I've often gotten when discussing these issues is that to explain NDEs in terms of things like brain processes, naturally occurring chemicals such as DMT, the way our perceptual systems and memories work, and so on, it robs them of their meaning and power. One hallmark of NDEs, especially deep ones, is that they are very meaningful for those who have them. Indeed, there's evidence that they often transform people for the better, make them less selfish, more empathic, more spiritual. And these effects have been found to become more pronounced over time. NDEs don't just transform people in the near term, the transformations cement as time goes on. Moreover, it's worth noting that the transformative effects of NDEs, they've been studied in relation to other survivors of cardiac arrest, for example. So it's not merely surviving a brush with death that's doing the good work here. So no one should want to rain on such a parade. I certainly don't want to, and I don't think I am. To see why, let's begin by considering reasons to think that naturalistic explanations don't undermine meaningfulness in general. Consider sunrises, or sunsets, depending on your sleep patterns. I wake up early. One of my favorite features of the house in which I live is that we have a large window facing due east. And a wonderful way to start my day is by sipping a cup of coffee and watching the Texas sky turn shades of red, pink, orange, and then blue. I'm even known for telling my family that they should come quick and take a gander before the sunrise is over. They sometimes even begrudgingly oblige. Sometimes. I'm fully aware that the beauty of a sunrise is a function of the scattering of sunlight as it hits our atmosphere, and that changes in the color of the sky depend on various factors, including angles and distance. I'm even aware that air pollution enhances the visual phenomenon I cherish. This doesn't stop me from pausing my routine to appreciate it. Doesn't make it brighten my day any less. Doesn't make me any less enthusiastic to share the experience with others. Watching the sunrise makes me happy because it's so beautiful. And I don't have to attribute the phenomenon to anything supernatural for this to happen. I'm not suggesting I'm transformed by sunrises in the way NDEers are transformed by their experiences. But sunrises aren't the only naturalistically explicable phenomenon we might consider. There's been increasing interest of late in the positive psychological effects of hallucinogens, such as psilocybin, magic mushrooms. Patients, clinicians, policymakers, and the public have become increasingly interested in the possibility that controlled use of these substances can have positive transformative effects on, for instance, people suffering from depression or PTSD. And it doesn't seem like positive transformation requires attributing one's trip to a supernatural cause. Even if they're not focusing on these facts during their sessions, these patients know they've ingested a substance to induce these profound experiences. Unlike sunrises, this example touches on NDEs quite directly. In his book Hallucinations, Oliver Sacks includes the story of a man who had an acid trip with many of the same hallmarks of an NDE. Nonverbal communication, a life review, an out-of-body experience, pleasant feelings, traveling through light, and meeting deceased people. This man knew that his experience was caused by LSD, and yet that didn't undermine its meaning and significance for him. So I just think there isn't good reason to suppose that meaningful, transformative experiences like NDEs must be understood in supernatural terms by those who have and are changed by them. Of course, this doesn't mean that there aren't people who have profound experiences, including both NDEs and hallucinogenic trips, and who do understand them in supernatural terms. Doesn't it deflate the awesomeness of such experiences to insist that they're understandable in naturalistic terms? I want to push back on this objection in two stages. First, I'll contend that the supernaturalist isn't actually better positioned with respect to making sense of these experiences. Both supernatural and natural explanations of NDEs are incomplete, just not in the same ways. Second, I want to suggest that part of what's so awe-inspiring about these experiences is that they reveal our incomplete grasp of things. Rather than a bug, incomplete explanations are a feature when it comes to awesomeness. According to the supernaturalists, the explanation for how Pam Reynolds was able to hear the conversation between medical staff about her veins, visit with deceased relatives, and return to her body is that she was a soul that detached from her body, hovered in the waiting room for a bit, and then traveled to another realm. And the explanation for why this experience was so transformative for her is that she encountered an aspect of reality that was hidden to her as long as she was trapped in her body. She came to have a deeper, truer grasp of things through this experience. Similar remarks applied to the supernaturalist explanations of NDEs like Aben Alexander's and Colton Burpo's. But in Burpo's case, there's an added dimension of explicitly Christian theology. Burpo's experience of meeting Jesus and God is explained not just in terms of his soul separating from his body and traveling to another realm, but also in terms of that realm being heaven as described in the Bible. Furthermore, all of this is supposed to be explained at root by the power and grace of God. Burpo's NDE is proof that heaven is for real because God granted him direct access to this aspect of reality. Normally, those of us walking on earth have to wait for such access. Burpo was given a sneak peek, if you will. And like in Plato's myth of Ur, he came back to tell us about it, if only we'd heed his lesson. You might be wondering how I could possibly think that these explanations are incomplete in anything like the way that the naturalistic ones are. After all, the naturalist admits that his explanation is speculative in crucial respects. I don't have a complete story to tell about how Burpo came to know about his mother's miscarriage, or how exactly Reynolds was able to relate the conversation about her veins. The supernaturalist, by contrast, contends that these aspects of these NDEs are explained by an encounter with another disembodied soul in heaven, on the one hand, and the direct perception of earthly activities by a disembodied soul on the other. But if we push a bit deeper, we can see that the supernaturalist, too, has some explaining to do. As John and I point out in our book, even if the supernaturalist has a ready explanation for how Reynolds heard the conversation during her surgery, She still needs to explain how Reynolds was able to hear conversations before and after her NDE. How can the soul interact with sensory organs while inside the body? Actually, this isn't a new problem at all. It's been around for a long time. The interaction problem, as it's known, is one of the challenges facing the dualist, who thinks that there are both material and immaterial substances, such as bodies and souls. That's one way in which the supernaturalist explanation of NDEs is incomplete. It has to explain not just how things work during NDEs, but also how they work in run-of-the-mill contexts, like the one that we're having together now. A second way in which the supernaturalist explanation is incomplete is that it bottoms out, ultimately, in something that we can't fully grasp. In Burpo's case, the explanation offered bottoms out in God. The idea is supposed to be that Burpo's NDE was so profound because he had direct acquaintance with a higher power, one that the rest of us must accept on faith. We can't see or hear or touch God directly, earthly creatures that we currently are. We have to accept his truth on the basis of testimony, such as that presented in Scripture and shared by those, such as Colt and Burpo, who've been granted more direct access to the divine truth. Perhaps Pam Reynolds' case bottoms out in something slightly different. There are many interpretations of the otherworldly realms NDEers experience. But the same basic point holds. What's so special in the case of NDEs like these is that they transcend what we can directly experience through our five senses. Whatever proof these NDEs provide for what lies beyond our ken depends ultimately on faith. We must have faith that the reports we're receiving are true and accurate, and we must have faith in the foundational aspects of reality they're supposed to have revealed to those who've come back from the other side. My point isn't that we shouldn't have such faith. Many people do, and who am I to instruct them otherwise? My point is that the supernaturalist explanations of NDEs are in important ways incomplete. So it's not a consideration in favor of supernaturalism to point out that naturalistic explanations are incomplete. In short, we both have further explaining to do. And that brings me to the punchline. I'm finally ready to say something about awesomeness and its connection with belief. It seems to me that a talk that takes 40 minutes to get to awesomeness is more awesome. It seems to me that awesomeness resides where belief is unsettled. Near-death experiences inspire awe and wonder, in part because we can't fully wrap our heads around them. It'd be too much to say that NDEs are awesome just because we can't fully explain them. Not everything that's inexplicable is awesome. We don't consider a disease like Alzheimer's, for which there's no known cause, awesome, more like terrible. So there must be something in addition to inexplicability that accounts for the awesomeness of NDEs. In our book, John and I argue that NDEs are meaningful, even when explained in naturalistic terms, because they're emotionally gripping. They fit familiar narrative patterns that resonate with us given our penchant for making sense of things through stories. We aren't just explainers, we're also narrators. Narrative understanding engages our emotions while explanation engages our intellect. Now, John has written quite a bit about narrative and meaning, and I don't have much insightful to add here. It seems to me, though, that there's an important connection between the sort of meaning conferred by narrative and awesomeness. It's not as if everything meaningful in this sense is awesome. We don't, for instance, take all stories to be awesome, even if they do grip us emotionally. But perhaps everything that's awesome is emotionally gripping. Sunrises follow a recognizable progression, and they certainly tug on my heartstrings. It's worth considering, I think, the possibility that the awesomeness of NDEs is due to the combination of meaning and inexplicability. But even this isn't quite right, and further consideration of supernatural explanations of NDEs and naturalistic explanations of sunrises can help us to see why. In both cases, we seem to have complete explanations of the target phenomena. The supernaturalist makes intellectual sense of NDEs in terms of disembodied souls, otherworldly realms, and a higher power. The naturalist makes intellectual sense of sunrises in terms of light, wavelengths, atmosphere, and angles. And yet, despite these explanations, the phenomena in question strike us as awesome. So it seems that awesomeness isn't simply a function of meaning plus inexplicability. So what gives? I think the answer is that awesomeness doesn't necessarily require the inexplicability of the awesome phenomenon. It requires that the awesome phenomenon reveal the limits of our understanding. That limit may apply to the phenomenon itself, or it may apply to related things. We've already noted that supernatural explanations of NDEs only seem complete. Even if appeals to disembodied souls and otherworldly realms help us to make intellectual sense of NDEs, they raise further questions that cry out for answers. How does embodied perception on Earth work? If our souls can see and hear outside our bodies, then how do they do so from within and in conjunction with them? Scientific explanations of sunrises too raise further questions. How did our planet come to have the atmosphere it does? And how did we come to perceive the interaction between light waves and atmospheric particles in the way that we do? Zooming out a bit, how did the universe come to have such things as stars, solar systems, and planetary atmospheres? Come to think of it, why is there a universe to begin with? These are cases where an explanation of one thing reveals the limits of our understanding by raising questions about other things. Naturalistic explanations of NDEs, by contrast, reveal the limits of our understanding more directly. These sorts of explanations of NDEs are works in progress. We may have a framework for how to provide them, but we're not entirely sure how to fill in the details. What's more, the naturalist acknowledges the incompleteness of the explanations he offers. He faces up to the fact that these experiences challenge our ability to grasp our world and ourselves. Even though he may be portrayed as a dense jerk, unwilling to open his mind to the awesome truth, there's a sense in which the naturalist is the one whose mind is most open to awe and wonder. He's comfortable with explanatory placeholders, and at the same time confident in humanity's future progress, understanding the world through better tools and better theories. The supernaturalist plugs gaps in understanding by appeal to explanatory factors we must take on faith. The naturalist leaves the gaps unplugged, at least for now, in full recognition of the limits of his own powers of understanding. Thus, despite appearances, the naturalist seems to be an even greater friend to awe and wonder than the supernaturalist. By pointing out and sitting with the gaps in our web of belief, he calls attention to what's awesome. And when the current gaps get filled, he welcomes the new ones that are opened up. Even from within the scientific worldview, awesomeness appears to know no bounds. Thanks for listening.
Thank you. That was, sorry about the lights, by the way. That was my bad. We're going to allow Dr. Mitchell Yellen to call on if anybody has questions.
Call me Ben.
Ben.
Ben's great.
Ben. We're going to let Ben, if you guys have questions, and I will run around with the mic, and you all can laugh at me while I run. So.
I'll take executive privileges and take
Yeah, great.
Oh, good job.
Hello, Dr. Ben. That was awesome.
Thank you.
So, sort of adjacent to near-death experiences, when people are near death, they have similar experiences
Okay.
about, seeing dead loved ones or seeing bright lights and whatnot. How is that related to what you studied?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you're talking about like deathbed visions and things like that? Yeah, which are pretty common experiences. How are they related? Well, I don't exactly know, but here's one thing that I think is oftentimes going on, or at least here's a way that I would want to start to try to understand these in naturalistic terms. Think about the comment about Pam Reynolds when I was saying the second step in the explanatory strategy is why would they be having an experience with this? Why would she hear, basically if she remembers hearing a conversation about her veins, They'd be like, of all the things that you might pay attention to, why would you pay attention to that? Well, the thought there was like it might be kind of soothing for her, and this is pretty radical stuff. Like, hey, don't worry, we're gonna drain your brain of blood, and then fill it back up, and you'll be all good when we're done, right? You might have a little bit of fear of that, right? And so, like, it might be helpful to kind of know something about what's going on. That might kind of assuage that fear or kind of quell that anxiety a bit. And I think with deathbed vision, similar things might be going on. It's very common, if not universal to some degree, but it's very common to fear death. And when you're getting close to it, it's also very common for it to be more frightful because it's like impending. And so deathbed visions might have something like a soothing function. I mean, that doesn't tell you exactly like causally what's going on, but it gets to like some similarities with the NDEs. That was part of your question. But also I think like, and deathbed visions are awesome. And in part, I guess, sticking with the talk, because we don't know exactly what's going on. But I do think that they can be very, and they can be comforting not just to the person having them, but sometimes you'll talk to people who were attending, like they were sitting with somebody in their final moments, and then they said it was really beautiful because they said that they were speaking to their brother who had passed away a decade ago, right? And who they were really close with when they were young or something. And that can make the family, for example, or the loved ones feel like, oh yeah, they were being met on the other side by somebody. So it can also have a soothing function for the people near them.
Thanks for the talk, Ben.
Yeah, thanks.
Question about naturalism versus supernaturalism.
Yeah.
I'm imagining somebody who says, oh, I don't believe anything spooky or religious or God or anything like that, but given what we know about consciousness, I don't have much of a problem with a human person ultimately being non-physical, and even other realms and so on, given what we know about the possibility of multiverse and so on. So what would it take for a naturalist of that kind to cross the line into supernaturalism? So I'm just looking for clarity on how you're using those two terms.
Yeah, it's a really good thing to ask about. All I gave you in the talk, and I don't have much else to give, is like, I think of naturalism to be tied to the gloss I gave and the gloss we give in the book of physicalism is like everything is in principle at least measurable and observable. And so the idea is like we might not be able to do it now. Like for example, our tools might not be, we might not be able to get a fine-grained enough picture to measure and observe fundamental particles or something. But in principle, that's possible. That's one way of understanding physicalism, which is then I'm understanding naturalism is really just like what trucks in only the physical. But so you were asking like with somebody who's like a multiverse theorist, are they a supernaturalist? That's part of what's behind your question, right? Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it depends maybe on how they're thinking of, I don't see why you couldn't have multiple physical dimensions. So I don't think like multiverse theory, at least on some versions of it, needs to be supernatural. It's weird, right?
Pushing the weirdness.
Yeah, so I don't think that, yeah, so I guess maybe part of the answer is like, naturalists can be weird too, right? In fact, they probably are really weird in a lot of ways, because natural stuff can be really weird. And that might be part of what makes it awesome. But a supernaturalist, to answer your question, would, I guess I'm interpreting, at least in the context of NDEs, so getting the weeds a bit, like more like substance dualists, right? Not property dualists, maybe, I don't know. Some version, I don't know. That stuff really gets, like, I kind of lose my grip sometimes. If you say that there's stuff that we can't even in principle measure and observe, like it just doesn't interact in the right ways with physical stuff, then you're a supernaturalist. Does that help?
So definitionally, a dualist would be supernatural.
Yeah, yeah. We have a question up there, yeah.
You said you died and went to heaven, right? So there's a message behind it. That way, that God gives as a messenger to go all over the world to preach to him. That way people could come to him.
Yeah.
Correct. Was there a message to you?
So
I think, just to clarify, he said you have not had a
yeah,
near-death
I did
experience.
not go. So the stories I was giving were other people, but definitely like I think the part of what was powerful to many people, especially including the Burpos of Colton Burpos, the boy who had the near-death experience at age 3, and then like told about it when he was 4. They definitely saw it as what you were saying. Like he went to the other side and came back to tell us. And then I also related that at the end of Plato's Republic, the myth of Ur is doing the same thing. Like the story there is you had this guy who died on the battlefield, went to the other side, saw all these people screw up their choice in the next life because they didn't live correctly in this one, and then came back to tell people about it. This is at the end of a book basically telling you how to live correctly. So this is a trope in near-death experiences quite often. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but
Kind of, but yet there is a message when you go to heaven
yeah,
that it comes back and they testify
yes.
the testimony to all.
Yes. Yeah, these are a really profound form of testimony, right? Because, like, we might read authoritative texts, right? But then if you have somebody who, like, had this experience, and that's part of what I think is powerful about, like, believing them that they had this experience, right? And so, but then their testimony is more direct and can oftentimes seem like way more powerful than, say, reading about it. Yeah. Sarah, I thought I saw another hand over here. So yes.
In your years of
Yeah, make her run. Come on, she's telling me. Promise we get to see her run.
Thank you. I wanted to ask, in your years of studying and research, if you have ever encountered anybody who has experienced both a near-death experience and like a drug-induced trip, I guess, and how the two encounters.
Yeah.
Have you done drugs then?
I'll never tell.
ask for a friend.
I'm sure that there are people. I'm trying to think if I have heard from or read one where somebody has like clearly had similar experiences in both ways, and I'm not sure. No one's coming to mind. But that can't be right. There's gotta be. Is there some? Are you just like curious, or is there
No,
some
it's
reason?
just curiosity, like if there's someone who had a near-death experience
Yeah.
and a drug-induced one,
Yeah.
they're similar, different.
I mean, there certainly are people who have had what's sometimes referred to as like near-death episodes. That's like a brush with death, right? And that might be like, so for example, think of combat veterans, and that can be a source of PTSD. And then there is like serious work with trying to use hallucinogenic substances to help even this population of people with PTSD. So there's got to be cases where people have, like in that case, but now, just because you have a near-death episode doesn't mean that you would have had this sort of special state of consciousness during, or like apparently during that episode. But there's got to be, and that's really good. So is your thought that these would be people that you'd really want to talk to really see
Like,
about the
like-
different, knowing the different causes and how it affects them?
Like have
Yeah, that's
someone who
good.
experienced it,
Yeah.
maybe do some drugs to see.
Yeah.
We gotta figure it out.
Yeah, no, that's good. I mean, I like where you're thinking. That's a very good point. that those would be people who would have kind of had experience with both types. I mean, it is interesting though, like the guy that Oliver Sacks talks about, who had the LSD trip that had all the hallmarks of near-death experience. That guy, by his own report, was speaking of it in ways like what Abe and Alexander and the NDEers, how they speak of their experiences. So for him, it was like really profound, and it really changed him and stuff in a lot of the same ways. And even though it had like a really different origin, yeah.
Hi, Dr. Ben. I was wondering if you have like any experience with like amputees, like as you were talking earlier, like how they would experience like the phantom, like your phone going off and things. Like how if they felt that, or so they felt like a presence, like because I've had an experience where when I was in the hospital getting my finger amputated, I felt like something was grabbing onto me. I couldn't breathe. I took it as a panic attack. But I was wondering if there's like other cases like that where like they feel like something's hovering over them before they lose the limb or after.
Huh, no, so that's interesting. So you're saying in your own experience, you felt like you had a panic attack?
It felt more like something was holding on to me, as preparing me, saying like, it's okay, you'll be fine, but also at the same time, like if death happens, that happens. My mind was spiraling, especially like even after surgery. I just felt like my finger was like moving constantly, even though I knew it wasn't there, and there was a presence just hovering over me saying like, it's fine, it's past. Like.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. So I'm gonna answer your question, but I'm gonna say something that came to mind that's related to it after. So the direct answer to your question is I don't know of cases like what you're describing where somebody was not. Like, I'm not sure if you took your the surgery to be a near-death episode, but it certainly was a profound and scary thing, and you were losing part of your body, or it was being removed. And so I'm not recalling stories I've heard like that where somebody has a special state of consciousness in that sort of moment. But I will say this: there's some famous studies, like sometimes they're referred to, like in social psychology, sometimes referred to as like the wobbly bridge studies. And so here's the thing. What they did is they would have a confederate is like somebody who's in on it with the researchers. So you'd have the subject and the confederate meet each other on like a wobbly footbridge, okay? And on a wobbly footbridge, what happens is you get a little anxious because it's wobbling and you're walking on it, right? So sweaty palms, things like that. Now, another time at which people sometimes get like sweaty palms and heart racing is when they're going on a first date or they're meeting somebody who they find attractive, but they don't really know them, right? And it turns out what they were doing in these experiments is that they're setting people up to have the same physiological responses that are associated with initial sexual attraction, okay? But they're inducing it like through the footbridge. And then they will ask people afterwards, like, were you attracted to that person? And they're more likely to say yes when they met them on the wobbly footbridge. And the explanation there is that they're interpreting their sweaty palms and racing heart as sexual attraction. But really the cause of it is that they're on a wobbly footbridge. And so how does that relate to what you were saying? Is like, so similar to what I was saying in response to your first questions, I think sometimes what happens is we have physiological responses and we also have psychological awareness, and we try to make up we can try to form an understanding of what's going on with our bodies, and that involves interpreting these feelings that we have, like sensations that we have. And sometimes we can interpret the sensations in ways that like make a lot of sense in the moment, and then we tell ourselves stories, right? Like, oh yeah, I just met the love of my life on this bridge, man. That was like wild, right? But really what happened is like somebody made me feel nervous, and then I was like kind of making up a story about why that was happening. Does that make sense? So I wonder if maybe that's sometimes what can happen in these situations where it's like, I'm really anxious about this thing, maybe in this death, right, or an amputation or something, and then I'm having these physiological responses, and then I make sense of it in terms of a story. I was being, you know, somebody was gripping me to tell me it was okay, right? Or, you know, I saw my brother who died 10 years ago, whatever it is. I think that there's the trappings of some explanations there that would be naturalistic of these things. Doesn't make them not meaningful, right? Like that's part of the whole point. I think I said that a ton of times in the talk, right? They can be important and meaningful, right? Even if they're explained in that way.
We're gonna take one more question, so.
Hey, good evening, doctor. I had a question. I had a military background, right? And so I know a lot of veteran friends that say that we kind of feel like we're the guinea pigs on certain stuff. And I was wondering, do you know, this sounds like very complicated stuff, studying near-death experiences, its effect on the brain, and you talked about how mushrooms for use for PTSD and depression. I'm worried about, should we be talking about laws that protect the public from this kind of very dangerous experimental medicine, I would call it. Like, for example, MK Ultra. That's a government program in the past where people had drug-induced NDEs. And I'm saying is, do you think we need to be talking about safeguards for the public so that stuff like that doesn't happen again in the future?
So you mean like make sure that people aren't experimented on to see, hey, will this substance make them have these sorts of experiences?
Yeah, like, do you think the public needs to be educated on this stuff? And do you think we need laws to protect that kind of, you know, tragic incidents that happened in the past?
So what was the name of the program that you?
It was called MK Ultra. It was a CIA government program where they took random people, like a Harvard student called Ted Kaczynski. They took him and they gave him drug-induced NDEs. So I'm saying is, do you think the public needs safety measures to make sure that kind of experiments don't happen in the future?
Funny story about the Unabomber. He was for a time a student at the University of Michigan, and his dorm room was down the hall from where mine was. Not at the same time. And like it was like one of those things where you go on the third floor of East Quad, and like, hey, this is the Unabomber's dorm room. Okay, so there's a lot actually behind your comment, and I'll just say a couple quick things. One thing is like, I definitely am not in favor of like testing things on people without their consent. So if what you're talking about is a program where you just like trick somebody and then give them something and see what happens, not in favor of that. So definitely think that you need, like especially for serious stuff like what we're talking about, you need like informed consent. Now, do I think that another thing to say though is like, could you consent to, like, should you be able to consent to something where we don't have any idea what's going to happen to you? I don't know.
That seems very dangerous.
That's really tricky. I mean, that's complicated. Certainly not when you're too young, right? And also not if they were withholding information, like, so it also wouldn't be like correctly informed if they were like, hey, I think this might happen. Really, they know that like a bunch of stuff's gonna happen. They're not gonna tell you because they want your consent. That also wouldn't be okay. How do I feel about if people, under full knowledge, like everybody's open and sharing stuff and they want to consent to this stuff and the researchers are interested in seeing what happens? I don't know what to say. I mean, this gets into tricky waters. I also will say if we're talking about now look, not all NDEs are positive and not all trips are positive, and so there is some danger with that. But you know, we do consent to stuff where we don't know that the outcomes are going to be positive. That happens all the time. So as a general matter, I don't think that you can't consent to things without, like I don't think we want to prohibit like, hey, you can't do anything unless you're sure it's going to be okay. Right? You see, like there's a lot of tricky stuff in here. I mean, nobody would have any life-saving surgeries, if we could only consent to things if we knew with 100% certainty things were gonna be okay, right? So that's clearly too high of a standard. I don't know exactly where to set the standard, and I do think, I'll just say, like, my understanding of some of what's going on with the use, like the people wanting to use stuff like psilocybin to treat conditions like PTSD and severe depression. Part of what's going on is people feel like, look, other treatments aren't working. So maybe there's worth, but these are serious conditions and like really impairing people's lives. So if there is some hope that this might work, like maybe it's worth a shot. And another thing is like I'm not aware of people being forced to do it. And also I should say that like it's not just like acid or mushrooms that can induce NDE like things. G-force in fighter pilots. There's a guy out of the University of Kentucky that's done research on this. Like G-force at certain levels people can sometimes react in ways that are similar to near-death experiences. So it's not, sometimes people can have them when they're not, like from car crashes or something where they like thought that they were dying, maybe they didn't actually die. So it's not only like when your heart stopped or something. Yeah. I don't know, that was a bunch of word salad. And you brought up some very deep issues, but I do think there could be ways for this stuff to be done above board. And I'm sure there are examples where it hasn't been done correctly. It doesn't mean we couldn't do it correctly, yeah. And sometimes I think that people really do want to try this stuff out, maybe because they feel like this is the only way that, like, they've tried other things that hasn't worked. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Ben. All right. So, thank you so much. I learned a lot of things. I'll be doing some Googling. So, if you are in need of a proof of attendance ticket, aka a souvenir/credit from your teacher, come see me or my wonderful assistant, Debbie. Also, if you did not get a pin, please grab one. Our next event is February 21st, right here, same time, same place. Have a great night.
Thank you for coming. Thank you for the mic.
You're very welcome.
I took it off.
You mind just let me sign it? Okay, like show it to me first and sign it, and I'll sign it.
I didn't put you to sleep. That's great. Tell my daughter.